Millionaire humiliated his bride on wedding day, declared his mistress as wife, but her calm smile and deadly surprise turned his dream day into a nightmare forever. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to your own family channel, Mr. Peter Stories. May the Almighty shower endless grace upon you, turning every trial into triumph, every night into peace, and every single heartbeat into pure joy. May His mercy guard your homes, His light fill your souls, and His blessings overflow into every step you take. Amen. If you are here, type present. If you stand with me, type I am with Mr. Peter. My beloved family, every story I bring is not just words. It is my heart, my sweat, my sleepless nights, my sacrifice. When you leave early, it cuts deep as if my hard work is unseen, my voice unheard. Stay till the end, not for numbers, but because this family is built on loyalty, love, and trust. I don't know why my new family members doubt me, but you can ask from my old family. They will tell you how true, how loyal, and how deeply I love you. The moment before everything shattered, Delaney Cox had believed in fairy tales. Standing at the entrance of Rosewood Cathedral, she embodied every bride's dream in her great-grandmother's pearl-encrusted gown. The ivory silk caught Charleston's golden afternoon light, streaming through stained-glass windows, while 300 guests filled mahogany pews with whispered admiration. At 26, Delaney possessed a beauty that transcended mere physical perfection. Her deep brown skin seemed to glow from within. Her warm brown eyes held intelligence and kindness in equal measure, and her smile could heal broken hearts. The bouquet of white gardenias and baby's breath trembled slightly in her hands, the same flowers 4 generations of women in her family had carried down wedding aisles. Each petal represented hope, love, and the promise of forever with Daniel Willis, the man who had swept her off her feet with passionate declarations and grand gestures. "You look like a queen, baby girl," whispered Magnolia James, her 78-year-old grandmother, adjusting the vintage veil one last time. "Your great-great-grandmother would be so proud." Daniel stood waiting at the altar in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his sandy brown hair gleaming under the cathedral's lights. But something felt wrong. His blue eyes weren't fixed on her approaching figure. They kept darting to someone in the front row, and his confident smile seemed forced, artificial. The processional music swelled as Delaney glided down the rose-petal-strewn aisle, her heart fluttering with what she mistook for normal wedding nerves. Hidden beneath her joy was a secret that made this day even more precious. She was 3 months pregnant with their child, a miracle they had created in what she believed was perfect love. Pastor Williams opened his worn Bible, his voice carrying the weight of countless ceremonies. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered today in the sight of God to witness the holy union of Daniel Marcus Willis and Delaney Rose Cox in matrimony." The sacred words hung in the air like a prayer about to be answered, until Daniel raised his hand, stopping everything. "Wait." His voice cut through the cathedral's reverent silence like broken glass. "I have something to say." Delaney's heart stopped. The congregation stirred uneasily, 300 guests suddenly sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary and terrible. "I stand before God and these witnesses to speak the truth," Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength with each word that would destroy her world. "This woman is not my bride." The bouquet slipped from Delaney's numb fingers, white petals scattering across marble steps like fallen snow. Gasps and murmurs erupted throughout the cathedral, but all she could hear was the roar of her own blood in her ears. Daniel turned toward the front pew, where a petite blonde woman sat in a stunning emerald dress, her green eyes sparkling with triumph rather than surprise. "Seraphina Vale is my true bride, my soulmate, the woman I choose to marry." Seraphina rose gracefully, her ruby lips curved in a smile that held no warmth, only victory. The emerald gown hugged her willowy frame as she walked toward the altar, her heels clicking against marble like a countdown to devastation. "Daniel, what are you doing?" Pastor Williams asked, his face pale with shock. "I'm choosing love over obligation," Daniel replied, though his eyes avoided Delaney's stricken face. "Serafina and I have been together for 8 months. She understands me in ways that—" "Stop!" Delaney's voice rang clear and strong through the cathedral, cutting through his cruel explanation. Despite the trembling in her hands, her spine straightened with the pride of women who had survived far worse than public humiliation. The cathedral fell silent, except for Magnolia's quiet weeping and the distant sound of church bells from across Charleston. In the third row, Jude Glover, Daniel's former business partner, gripped the pew in front of him, his handsome face etched with horror and something that looked like rage. Delaney surveyed the sea of faces, some shocked, some pitying, others openly curious about the scandal unfolding before them. But instead of crumbling, she felt something fierce and powerful rising within her. "You want truth?" Her voice grew stronger, filling the vast space with authority. "Let me give you truth, Daniel Willis." She placed a protective hand over her still flat stomach, the gesture subtle but unmistakable to those in the front rows. "I'm carrying your child, 3 months along." The revelation hit the congregation like lightning. Serafina's triumphant smile faltered, though she quickly recovered. Daniel's face went white, his confident demeanor cracking. "And according to the prenuptial agreement you insisted I sign," Delaney continued, her voice carrying the precision of someone who had read every clause, "any child born of our union becomes an immediate 40% shareholder in Willis Enterprises with full voting rights upon birth." Daniel's eyes widened in horror as the implications crashed over him. The prenuptial agreement had been his idea, designed to protect his wealth from what he saw as a fortune-hunting bride. But his lawyers had crafted it too well. They had never anticipated this scenario. "Congratulations, Daniel," Delaney said, her voice ringing with newfound power. "You may have chosen another woman, but you've just made my unborn child your business partner." She turned to face the congregation, her head held high despite tears threatening to fall. "This wedding is over, but my life, our life," she touched her stomach again, "is just beginning." The sound of her heels echoed through the cathedral as she walked back down the aisle, leaving behind not just a failed wedding, but the naive woman who had believed that love conquered all. Behind her, chaos erupted. Guests whispered frantically. Phones appeared to capture the scandal, and Serafina's voice rose shrilly as she demanded explanations. Magnolia waited by the limousine, her weathered hands reaching for her granddaughter with infinite love and understanding. "Come on, baby girl, let's go home." As Charleston's skyline blurred past the car windows, Delaney pressed her palm to the glass, watching the Gothic cathedral spires fade into memory. Somewhere in that building, Daniel was probably trying to comprehend the legal nightmare she had just created. Somewhere, Serafina was learning that stealing another woman's groom came with unexpected consequences. The prenuptial agreement lay like a loaded weapon in the wreckage of Daniel's perfect plan. In 6 months, he would become father to a child who owned nearly half his empire. In 6 months, Delaney Cox would become the most powerful woman in his life, whether he wanted it or not. The game had changed completely, and she intended to win. Chapter 2. Ashes and Foundations. 3 months after the cathedral catastrophe, Delaney discovered that rebuilding a life from betrayal required more than courage. It demanded the kind of quiet determination that had carried generations of her family through trials that would have broken weaker spirits. Morning sickness hit at dawn with ruthless precision, sending her rushing to the tiny bathroom of Magnolia's shotgun house in Charleston's historic district. The porcelain was chipped and the mirror cracked, but it was clean, safe, and theirs. a humbling change from the marble palace Daniel had promised. "That baby needs breakfast, even if you can't keep it down," Magnolia called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had raised 5 children on a seamstress's wage. Delaney splashed cold water on her face and studied her reflection. 3 months of stress had sharpened her features, but her brown eyes still blazed with determination. Success would be her revenge, and failure simply wasn't an option. The morning newspaper waited beside her plate, the business section displaying a headline that made her pulse quicken. Willis Enterprises stock drops amid legal uncertainty. If Daniel wanted to play games with her heart, she would play games with his bank account. The doorbell chimed at 8 o'clock sharp, announcing Isadora Chen's arrival. The brilliant young lawyer had taken Delaney's case despite her inability to pay the retainer up front, seeing it as the career-making challenge she had been waiting for. "DNA results confirmed," Isadora announced without preamble, settling her briefcase on Magnolia's dining room table. Her black hair was pulled into a severe bun, and her dark eyes held the intensity of someone who viewed law as both weapon and shield. "Daniel is definitely the father, and the prenuptial agreement is airtight. Your child will own 40% of Willis Enterprises the moment he or she takes their first breath." The victory should have felt sweeter, but Delaney had learned that true power came from building something, not just tearing others down. What about his request for joint custody? Denied until he acknowledges paternity publicly and provides financial support. Right now, he has 0 parental rights. Isadora smiled grimly. His legal team has been searching for loopholes for 3 months. They've found exactly none. Before Delaney could respond, the doorbell rang again. Through the lace curtains, she could see Jude Glover standing on the porch, his hands deep in his coat pockets, his expression uncertain. He looked different than he had at the wedding, older, with shadows under his green eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "I'll handle this," Magnolia said, but Delaney was already walking to the door. Jude stood there like a man confessing unknown sins. "I know I have no right to be here, but I needed to see if you were all right. I'm pregnant, publicly humiliated, and fighting for my child's future," Delaney replied, her hand resting on the doorframe. "But I'm standing, so I suppose that counts as all right." He winced at her bluntness. What Daniel did, what he continues to do, it's unconscionable. I've known him for 8 years, and I never imagined he was capable of such cruelty. "Yet you were his business partner." The words came out sharper than intended, but she had learned to be wary of wealthy men bearing sympathy. "Was," Jude emphasized. "I dissolved our partnership the day after the wedding. I testified in your favor regarding the prenuptial agreement, even though it cost me a $50 million development deal." This was news. Isadora had mentioned a crucial witness but hadn't revealed his identity. "Why would you sacrifice that much money?" Jude's green eyes met hers directly. "Because what he did was wrong, because you deserved better, because someone needed to stand up for what was right. And losing $50 million felt right to you. Money can be earned again. Integrity, once lost, is gone forever." Delaney studied his face, searching for deception, but finding only exhaustion and a sincerity that seemed to emanate from his core. "I should go," Jude said, stepping back. "I just wanted you to know that not everyone in Daniel's world supported what he did. And if you ever need anything—" "I don't need charity," Delaney interrupted, her pride flaring. "It wouldn't be charity," Jude replied quietly. "It would be justice." After he left, Delaney remained in the doorway watching his sedan disappear down the tree-lined street. Magnolia appeared beside her, drying her hands on a dish towel. "That man's got pain in his eyes," the older woman observed, "the kind that comes from caring too much about people who don't deserve it." "He's not my concern," Delaney said. though she found herself wondering what kind of man sacrificed $50 million for principle. That afternoon, she stood in the empty storefront that would become Magnolia's Catering, named for the woman who had taught her that food was love made tangible. The space needed work, but it was hers. The loan had been approved based on her business plan and Magnolia's property as collateral. "You sure about this timing?" Magnolia asked, running her fingers along the dusty counter. "Starting a business while pregnant isn't exactly ideal." "Ideal doesn't build empires," Delaney replied, pulling out her notebook filled with recipes, calculations, and dreams. "And I plan to build an empire." A delivery truck pulled up outside, and a cheerful driver entered carrying a massive arrangement of white roses and baby's breath, the same flowers from her ruined bouquet. Delaney's blood ran cold until she read the card. "For new beginnings and the courage to rebuild. J.G. From Jude Glover?" Magnolia asked, reading over her shoulder. Delaney stared at the flowers, remembering how her original bouquet had fallen when her world collapsed. These weren't the same flowers. They represented something different, not endings, but beginnings. "He doesn't even know me," she whispered. "Maybe that's why he can see you clearly," Magnolia replied. "Sometimes it takes a stranger to recognize what's been there all along." That evening, as Delaney planned menus and calculated costs at Magnolia's kitchen table, she found herself thinking about quiet voices and patient kindness and men who chose principle over profit. Jude Glover was becoming a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. But as her child grew beneath her heart and the first plans for her empire took shape on paper, Delaney began to understand that sometimes the most unexpected allies appeared in life's darkest moments. The war with Daniel was just beginning, but for the first time since the cathedral, she didn't feel like she was fighting alone. Chapter 3. The Weight of Truth. 6 months after cathedral bells had rung for a wedding that never was, Delaney Cox brought life into the world during Charleston's worst thunderstorm in decades, as if the heavens themselves were announcing the arrival of someone destined to change everything. Labor began at 3 in the morning, sharp pains that doubled her over in Magnolia's kitchen while she reviewed catering contracts by lamplight. The storm outside matched the intensity building within her, lightning illuminating the windows as each contraction reminded her that this child would be born into a battlefield she had never asked to enter. By noon, after 9 hours of labor that felt like a lifetime of preparation for war, she held her son, 7 pounds, 2 ounces of perfect determination with her warm brown eyes and his father's stubborn chin. The moment he entered the world, crying with the indignant fury of someone who had important business to attend to, Delaney felt the shift in the universe's balance. "Aurelius," she whispered. The name falling from her lips like a prayer answered and a battle cry combined. Aurelius James Cox. Magnolia leaned over the hospital bed, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she studied the baby's face with the intensity of someone reading prophecy. "Lord, that child's got purpose written all over his face. Look at those eyes, old soul in a brand new body, already planning how to change the world." Named for the Roman emperor known for wisdom and strength, Aurelius gazed up at his mother with the serious expression of someone who understood the weight of destiny pressing down on his tiny shoulders. At the exact moment of his birth, he had become one of the most powerful shareholders in Willis Enterprises, owning 40% of a company worth over $200 million. The irony wasn't lost on Delaney. Her son was technically wealthier than most adults would ever be, yet they lived in a shotgun house and she calculated grocery expenses down to the penny. But wealth, she was learning, wasn't about money in the bank. It was about power to choose your own destiny. "Miss Cox?" A young nurse entered, holding a massive arrangement of blue and white flowers that seemed to fill the entire doorway. "These arrived for you about an hour ago." Delaney's heart sank, expecting Daniel's attempt at reconciliation or manipulation. But the card bore familiar handwriting that had become a source of unexpected comfort. "Welcome to the world, Aurelius. May you grow up knowing you are deeply loved and that some people fight for what's right, not what's easy." JG. "That's the third delivery from him," Magnolia observed, her sharp eyes noting how her granddaughter's expression softened when she read the card. "Flowers when you opened the business, that beautiful hand-carved rocking chair for the nursery, and now this." "Why does he care about a stranger's child?" Delaney murmured, though warmth bloomed in her chest like spring flowers after a harsh winter. "Sometimes hearts recognize what minds haven't figured out yet," Magnolia said, with the wisdom of someone who had loved and lost and learned to love again. "And sometimes, baby girl, strangers care more than the people who should love you most." Commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Raised voices, the sharp staccato of stiletto heels on linoleum, and the unmistakable authority of hospital security trying to manage an increasingly volatile situation. Delaney's blood turned to ice as she recognized the voices cutting through the hospital's usual quiet. Daniel Willis burst through the door like a man claiming territory that had never belonged to him, his usually perfect appearance disheveled and desperate. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his sandy hair unkempt, and his blue eyes held the wild look of someone who had been drinking liquid courage before facing a battle he knew he was likely to lose. Behind him, Serafina Vale tottered on stiletto heels, her emerald dress a harsh, almost violent contrast to the sterile hospital environment. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the calculating gleam in her green eyes as she surveyed the room like a general assessing enemy territory. "Where is my son?" Daniel demanded, his voice carrying the entitled authority of someone who had never been told no. His gaze fixed on the bundle in Delaney's arms with an intensity that made her protective instincts flare. "Your son?" Delaney's voice could have frozen hell itself. "You forfeited any claim to parenthood when you chose another woman at our wedding altar in front of God and 300 witnesses." "DNA tests prove he's mine," Daniel said, pulling out official-looking documents with the desperation of someone playing his last card. "I have legal rights to this child." "You have no rights." Isadora Chen's voice cut through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. The lawyer appeared in the doorway, her dark suit impeccable despite being summoned to the hospital with urgent haste. "Under South Carolina law, unmarried fathers have no parental rights until they acknowledge paternity publicly and provide financial support." "I'm acknowledging it now," Daniel insisted, his voice rising with frustration. "After 6 months of denial? After trying to invalidate the prenuptial agreement you yourself demanded?" Isadora's smile was razor-sharp and twice as dangerous. "After publicly humiliating my client and attempting to destroy her reputation." Aurelius stirred in his mother's arms, his tiny fist grasping air as if reaching for something only he could see. The movement caught Daniel's attention, and for a moment his aggressive mask slipped to reveal something that looked almost like wonder mixed with terror. "He has my chin," Daniel whispered, stepping closer to the bed with the cautious movements of someone approaching something both precious and dangerous. "He has his great-grandfather's chin," Magnolia corrected firmly, rising from her chair with the dignity of a queen defending her throne. "My late husband had that same determined set to his jaw. That baby belongs to this family, not to you." Serafina pushed forward, her green eyes flashing with jealousy and something darker as she stared at the baby with undisguised resentment. "This is ridiculous, Daniel. The child is just a legal complication we need to manage efficiently." The words hung in the air like poison gas, contaminating everything they touched. Delaney felt something primal and fierce rise within her, the protective instinct of a mother wolf who would tear apart anyone threatening her cub. "Get out," Delaney said quietly, but her voice carried the absolute authority of someone who had found her true power. Both of you. Now. Delaney, please, Daniel began, his voice taking on a wheedling tone that made her skin crawl. We need to discuss this rationally. The child's future, his inheritance, his place in the family. But Aurelius chose that moment to open his eyes, fixing his gaze on his biological father, with an intensity that seemed impossible for a newborn. The baby's stare was deep, ancient, knowing, as if somehow this tiny person could see through Daniel's expensive facade to the hollow, selfish man beneath. The baby's tiny face scrunched up in what could only be described as profound disappointment, and he began to cry, not the normal fussing of a hungry infant, but the deep, mournful wail of someone who had looked into another's soul and found it wanting. Even he knows you're unworthy, Magnolia said, rising with the queenly dignity that came from 80 years of surviving life's storms. That child can sense your emptiness, Daniel Willis. Security guards appeared in the doorway, summoned by Isadora's quick thinking and the escalating tension that threatened to spill over into something ugly. Sir, ma'am, visiting hours are over for non-family members, and you're disturbing other patients. As Daniel was escorted toward the door, his desperation finally broke through his facade of control. This isn't over, Delaney, he called over his shoulder, his voice echoing down the hospital corridor. That boy is a Willis, and Willis money built him. He belongs with his father. The only thing that child belongs to is love, Magnolia called back, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had raised 3 generations with nothing but determination and fierce devotion, something you know absolutely nothing about. After they left, the room felt lighter, as if storm clouds had moved on to darken someone else's sky. Aurelius settled back into peaceful sleep, his tiny fingers wrapped around Delaney's thumb with surprising strength, the grip of someone who knew exactly where he belonged. That man's afraid, Magnolia observed, settling back into her chair with the satisfied expression of someone who had just won an important battle. Afraid of what this baby represents. What do you mean? Power. Real power. Magnolia's eyes glittered with the sharp intelligence that had guided her family through decades of struggle. That child owns 40% of Daniel's company. In 18 years, Aurelius will vote those shares himself. Until then, you control them as his guardian. Daniel Willis just realized he handed his enemy the keys to his kingdom. The full weight of responsibility settled over Delaney like a mantle both heavy and empowering. She wasn't just a single mother rebuilding her life from betrayal's ashes. She was guardian of a corporate dynasty, protector of a fortune, and wielder of power that could reshape Charleston's business landscape. I need to make a call, she said, reaching for her phone with newfound determination. To your lawyer? Magnolia asked. To Jude Glover. I need to understand exactly what weapons I'm holding. An hour later, Jude stood in the doorway, holding an expensive-looking teddy bear and coffee from Charleston's best cafe. He had clearly come straight from a business meeting, his charcoal suit perfectly tailored, but his green eyes held the gentle warmth she was beginning to associate with safety and genuine care. Congratulations, he said simply, his gaze moving from her to the sleeping baby with something that looked like reverence. He's absolutely beautiful. Daniel was here, Delaney said without preamble, her voice still carrying the steel that had emerged during the confrontation, making demands about rights he hasn't earned and will never deserve. Jude's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over the harbor. What did he want? His son, or rather, his son's shares in Willis Enterprises. Delaney shifted Aurelius to her other arm, marveling at how natural motherhood felt, how perfectly this tiny person fit against her heart. I need to understand exactly what I'm really facing, what kind of war I'm about to fight. Jude pulled up a chair, his voice dropping to the gentle tone of someone delivering news that would change everything. Daniel's company is hemorrhaging money like a ship with holes in the hull. The scandal cost him 3 major contracts, 2 key investors, and most of his credibility in the business community. He needs those shares desperately to maintain controlling interest. And if he doesn't get them, the company becomes vulnerable to hostile takeover or complete bankruptcy. Jude's green eyes met hers directly, and she saw both respect and something deeper in their depths. Your son doesn't just own 40% of Willis Enterprises, Delaney. He might be the only thing standing between Daniel and complete financial ruin. As if responding to the gravity of the conversation swirling around his tiny form, Aurelius opened his eyes and stared up at the adults discussing his future. For a moment, Delaney could swear she saw understanding in those brown depths, as if somehow her newborn son already grasped that he had been born not just into a family, but into a war that would define the rest of his life. The battle lines were drawn with crystalline clarity, and Aurelius James Cox was simultaneously the prize everyone would fight for and the weapon that would determine victory. But as Delaney looked from her son to the man who had sacrificed millions to stand for justice, she began to realize that sometimes the most powerful alliances were forged in the most unexpected places, and sometimes the greatest strength came not from standing alone, but from knowing when to trust someone else to stand with you. Chapter 4. Building Empire. 18 months after Aurelius's birth, Delaney Cox stood in the expanded kitchen of Magnolia's Catering, orchestrating a symphony of simmering sauces and rising soufflés while her toddler son napped peacefully in a nearby crib, as if the organized chaos of culinary creation was the most natural lullaby in the world. What had begun as desperate necessity had evolved into Charleston's most sought-after event planning service. The old shotgun house now bustled with controlled activity, 4 full-time employees, a refrigerated truck, and bookings stretching 8 months into the future. "Miss Delaney," called Ophelia Winters, her assistant manager, from the front office. "Mrs. Ashworth's assistant is on the phone about her daughter's engagement party. She wants to add champagne service for 300 guests. Tell her yes, but the price increases 25% for changes made less than a week before the event," Delaney replied, sliding a tray of her signature bourbon pecan tarts into the commercial oven. She had learned that wealthy clients respected confidence more than accommodation. Golden afternoon light streamed through kitchen windows, illuminating stainless steel surfaces she had fought to afford. Every appliance, every expansion, every success had been earned through 18-hour days, and the kind of determination that ran in the blood of women who built something from nothing. Aurelius stirred in his crib, making soft sounds that never failed to make Delaney's heart skip. At 18 months he was a beautiful child, with his mother's warm brown eyes and an emerging personality that suggested both intelligence and determination in equal measure. "You're going to rule the world someday, aren't you, little emperor?" she murmured, lifting him into her arms. He had started walking early, as if impatient to explore the world he would someday inherit a piece of. The front door chimed, and Delaney looked up to see a familiar figure, Jude Glover, holding what appeared to be a wooden toy truck and wearing the kind of smile that made her forget to breathe properly. Over the past 18 months, Jude had become a constant presence in their lives, though never in a way that felt presumptuous or demanding. He brought thoughtful gifts for Aurelius, asked intelligent questions about her business, and listened to her dreams with the kind of attention that made her feel valued. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, as Ophelia let him in. "I saw this at an antique shop and thought Aurelius might enjoy it." The truck was a masterpiece, carved from rich mahogany with functional wheels and tiny details that spoke of hours of craftsmanship. It was the kind of toy that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. "Jude, you can't keep buying him gifts," Delaney protested, though she could already see Aurelius reaching for the truck with delighted determination. "Why not? He's Jude stopped himself, color rising in his cheeks. I mean, I enjoy making him happy. Is that wrong? Delaney studied his face, noting how his green eyes softened when he looked at her son. The careful way he held the baby when she passed Aurelius to him. There was something profound in Jude's attention to the child. Not calculated interest, but genuine affection from someone who had room in his heart for love. How's the business expanding? Jude asked, settling into one of the kitchen chairs with Aurelius on his lap. The baby immediately grabbed for Jude's tie, chortling with delight when the silk slipped through his tiny fingers. Growing faster than I anticipated, Delaney admitted, checking on the tarts. I've got 4 major events next month, including the Pemberton wedding. 250 guests, all wanting the authentic Southern experience. That's remarkable, Jude said, and she could hear genuine pride in his voice. You're building something extraordinary. I'm building independence, Delaney corrected, for me and for him. Aurelius chose that moment to grab Jude's nose, squealing with laughter when the man made exaggerated gasping sounds. The sight of them together, the gentle businessman and the determined toddler, created an ache in Delaney's chest that she wasn't ready to examine closely. Delaney, Jude said carefully, as if weighing each word, there's something you need to know about Daniel's company. The warmth in the kitchen seemed to evaporate. What about it? Willis Enterprises is in serious trouble, worse than we initially thought. Jude shifted Aurelius to his other knee, his expression growing grave. He's defaulting on major loans, and there are rumors about federal investigations into his business practices. Good, Delaney said firmly. Let him fail. If Willis Enterprises goes under completely, Aurelius's shares become worthless. The truth hit her like cold water. She had been so focused on building her own success that she hadn't considered Daniel's complete collapse. How worthless? Potentially, though there's another scenario. Jude hesitated, clearly reluctant to continue. If the company is restructured or sold to new management, those shares could be worth significantly more than their current value. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you might want to pay attention to Daniel's decisions, not for his sake, but for Aurelius's financial future. Jude's green eyes met hers directly. Your son's inheritance is tied to a sinking ship. The question is whether you want to help right it or let it sink completely. Before Delaney could respond, her phone rang. Isadora Chen's number appeared on the screen. We have a problem, the lawyer said without preamble. Daniel is trying to liquidate company assets to cover debts. If he succeeds, Aurelius's shares will be significantly diluted in value. Can he do that legally? Not without majority shareholder approval, but he controls 51% to Aurelius's 40%. Isadora's voice carried tension. Unless what? Unless someone else acquires additional shares and votes with you. Delaney looked at Jude, who was now building a tower of wooden blocks for Aurelius to knock down. The baby's delighted shrieks filled the kitchen as blocks scattered across the floor. How much would it cost to acquire enough shares to block Daniel? She asked. More than you have, Isadora replied honestly. We're talking millions. After hanging up, Delaney stood at the kitchen window, watching late afternoon light fade across Charleston's skyline. Everything she had built felt suddenly fragile, threatened by forces beyond her control. There is another option, Jude said quietly. Which is? I could buy the shares. Delaney turned to stare at him. What? I have the capital, and I understand the company's true value better than most outside investors. Jude stood, lifting Aurelius with practiced ease. I could acquire enough shares to give you controlling interest. You and Aurelius would have power to protect his inheritance. Why would you do that? Jude was quiet for a long moment, his attention seemingly focused on adjusting Aurelius's tiny sweater. But when he looked up, his green eyes held a depth of emotion that made Delaney's breath catch. Because you deserve to have power to protect what's yours, he said simply. Because Aurelius deserves to inherit more than just money. He deserves justice. And because what? Because I believe in what you're building here, not just the business, but the life you're creating for your son. I want to be part of that, if you'll let me. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and danger. Delaney had spent 18 months learning to trust her own judgment, to rely on her own strength. Accepting help, especially financial help from a man, felt like stepping backward. But as she watched Jude bounce her son gently, murmuring something about teaching him to throw a baseball when he got bigger, Delaney began to understand that sometimes strength meant knowing when to accept an ally. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "That's all I ask." After Jude left, Delaney sat in her kitchen with Aurelius on her lap, surrounded by evidence of everything she had accomplished through determination alone. But for the first time since the cathedral, she wondered if perhaps she didn't have to fight every battle in isolation. Outside, Charleston settled into evening, and somewhere across the city, Daniel Willis was probably plotting his next desperate move. But here, in the warmth of her grandmother's house, Delaney held her son and contemplated the possibility that maybe she had found someone worthy of her trust. Chapter 5. The Gentle Revolution. 2.5 years after her world had shattered at the altar, Delaney Cox stood before floor-to-ceiling windows in her new downtown office, watching Charleston's historic district sparkle in morning light, while her empire grew stronger with each calculated risk she dared to take. Magnolia's Events now occupied an entire floor of a restored antebellum mansion on Meeting Street, complete with test kitchens, design studios, and a showroom that showcased the kind of Southern elegance money couldn't buy, but experience could create. The business had evolved far beyond catering into full-service event planning, and Delaney's client list read like Charleston society's who's who. "Mrs. Patterson wants to move her daughter's wedding to the Nathaniel Russell House," Ophelia announced, entering with her ever-present tablet and the efficiency that had made her invaluable. "She's willing to pay premium rates for exclusivity." "Book it," Delaney replied, turning from the window. At 28, she had grown into her power like fine clothing, elegant, commanding, and impossible to ignore. Success suited her, adding confidence to her natural beauty and steel to her already formidable will. Laughter echoed from the building's courtyard below, where Aurelius played with children from the daycare center she had established for her employees. At 2.5, he was a force of nature, bright, curious, and possessed of his mother's determination, combined with charm that could melt the sternest hearts. "And Mr. Glover called," Ophelia added, her voice carefully neutral. "He wanted to confirm this afternoon's appointment." Delaney's pulse quickened despite her efforts to remain composed. Over the past year, Jude had become more than just a potential investor. He had become her confidant, business advisor, and something dangerously close to her dearest friend. "Send him up when he arrives," Delaney said, settling behind her mahogany desk. Afternoon sun streaming through tall windows caught the warmth in her brown eyes, highlighting the strength that had carried her through 2.5 years of building something extraordinary from betrayal's ashes. Jude appeared at precisely 3 o'clock, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the kind of smile that had become as familiar as her morning coffee. At 31, he had grown more attractive with time. The young man she remembered from Daniel's dinner parties had evolved into someone who carried authority naturally while maintaining genuine warmth. "The quarterly reports," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Willis Enterprises is still losing money, but the bleeding has slowed considerably." "Progress," Delaney replied, accepting the documents. "What about Daniel's latest scheme?" "He's attempting to sell the commercial real estate division to cover immediate debts. Success would stabilize the company short-term, but damage long-term value significantly. Can we stop him? With our combined shares? Absolutely. Jude leaned forward, his green eyes serious. But there's something else we need to discuss. Before he could continue, the door burst open and Aurelius toddled in, his dark curls bouncing with each determined step. At 2.5, he had mastered the art of charming his way into any room he wanted to enter. "Mama!" he announced, raising his arms to be lifted. His vocabulary expanded daily, though he seemed to save his most impressive words for moments when he wanted something specific. "What are you doing here, little emperor?" Delaney asked, scooping him into her lap. "Isn't it rest time?" "No rest," Aurelius declared with the authority of someone who had never understood why adults insisted on such ridiculous concepts. His warm brown eyes, so like his mother's, fixed on Jude with obvious delight. "Jude!" "Hello, young man," Jude said, his voice taking on the gentle tone he reserved for children and conversations about things that mattered deeply. "Did you escape from Miss Sarah again?" Aurelius giggled, hiding his face in his mother's shoulder with the dramatic flair of someone who knew he was adorable and wasn't above using it to his advantage. "I should take him back to daycare," Delaney began, but Jude shook his head. "Actually, what I need to discuss concerns him too." Delaney settled back in her chair, adjusting Aurelius so he could play with the wooden truck Jude had given him. The same truck that had become his constant companion and now showed signs of loving wear. "Daniel made an offer," Jude continued carefully. "He wants to buy back the shares we've been discussing." "For how much?" "Significantly more than what they cost initially, enough to fund your expansion plans for the next decade." Jude's expression was unreadable. "It would also give him back controlling interest in his company." Delaney felt something cold settle in her stomach. "And you're considering it?" "I'm considering what's best for you and Aurelius." Jude's voice carried the patience of someone who had thought through every angle. "The money would give you complete independence. You wouldn't need to worry about Willis Enterprises' volatility or Daniel's business decisions. And it would let Daniel escape consequences for what he did to us. Money isn't justice, Delaney. It's just money." Aurelius looked up at his mother, as if sensing tension in her voice. His tiny hand patted her cheek with the unconscious comfort of a child who understood that sometimes adults needed reassurance too. "What do you think I should do?" Delaney asked. "I think," Jude said slowly, "that you should do whatever feels right for your family. If that means selling the shares and walking away with enough money to secure Aurelius's future, then that's what we'll do. If it means holding on to them and continuing to make Daniel's life complicated, then that's what we'll do." "What would you do?" Jude was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her to Aurelius and back again. "I'd ask myself whether revenge was worth more than peace." "And what would your answer be?" "That depends," he said, his green eyes meeting hers with intensity that made her breath catch. "On whether I had something better to fight for than the past." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that went far beyond business discussions and stock portfolios. Aurelius chose that moment to reach for Jude, his chubby arms extended with the trust of a child who had never known anything but kindness from this man. Jude took the toddler carefully, settling him on his lap with the practiced ease of someone who had helped raise him from infancy. Aurelius immediately began showing him the truck, babbling in the mixture of real words and toddler language that somehow seemed perfectly logical to both of them. "Truck," Aurelius announced, pointing to the toy's wheels. "Yes, the wheels make it roll," Jude agreed seriously. "Very good observation." Watching them together, Delaney felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of defenses she hadn't even realized she was still maintaining. This man had spent over a year proving himself through actions rather than words, through patience rather than pressure, through the kind of consistent kindness that spoke to character rather than agenda. "Jude," she said quietly. "Yes? Why haven't you asked me out?" The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. Aurelius looked back and forth between them, as if following a conversation in a language he was just beginning to understand. "Because," Jude said carefully, "I didn't want you to think I was helping you because I expected something in return. Your trust isn't something to be purchased or manipulated, it has to be earned. And have you earned it? That's not for me to decide." Aurelius patted Jude's cheek the same way he had comforted his mother, then leaned forward to give him a slobbery toddler kiss on the nose. The gesture was so spontaneous and sweet that both adults laughed. "I think someone's trying to tell us something," Jude said, his voice warm with affection. "He has excellent instincts," Delaney admitted. "Better than his mother sometimes." "His mother has perfect instincts. She's just had them tested by people who didn't deserve her trust." Late afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the office floor. Outside, Charleston was settling into the golden hour, when the old city looked like something from a storybook. "Don't sell the shares," Delaney said suddenly. "Are you sure?" "Daniel chose to humiliate me publicly. He chose to deny his son. He chose to make our lives difficult." She took Aurelius back into her arms, feeling the solid weight of his trust and love. "I don't want his money. I want him to live with the consequences of his choices." "And what about us?" Jude asked quietly. "What about what you're building here?" Delaney looked at this man who had given up millions to stand for justice, who had spent over a year proving his character through patient kindness, who held her son like the precious gift he was. "Maybe," she said carefully, "it's time I stopped building walls and started building something else." "What did you have in mind?" "Why don't you take me to dinner and find out?" Jude's smile could have illuminated all of Charleston. "I thought you'd never ask." As they gathered their things to leave, Aurelius clapped his hands with delight, as if he understood that something wonderful had just happened. Outside, the city glowed in evening light, and for the first time in 2.5 years, Delaney allowed herself to believe that maybe the best chapters of her story were still being written. Chapter 6. Walls Crumbling. 4 months after their first dinner together, Delaney Cox discovered that falling in love was nothing like she had expected. It wasn't the desperate, consuming passion she had felt for Daniel, but something quieter and infinitely more powerful, the steady certainty of finding home in another person's heart. December rain drummed against the windows of her expanded office as she reviewed contracts for the Whitmore Foundation's annual gala, her biggest event yet. 400 guests, including Charleston's most influential families, would gather to raise money for literacy programs in underserved communities, a cause close to Delaney's heart and one that would establish her company as more than just a business, but a force for positive change. The past 4 months had been a revelation. Jude had courted her with the patience of someone who understood that trust, once broken, required careful rebuilding. Their dates had been simple but meaningful, walks through Charleston's historic district, quiet dinners where they talked until the restaurant closed around them, afternoons spent watching Aurelius discover the world with wide-eyed wonder. "The floral arrangements alone are costing $50,000, Ophelia announced, spreading invoices across the mahogany desk. "But Mrs. Whitmore insists on having gardenias flown in from Savannah." "Gardenias," Delaney murmured, remembering the flowers from her ruined bouquet, how they had scattered across cathedral marble like fallen stars. Strange how something that had once symbolized destruction could now represent triumph. "Should I confirm the order?" Ophelia asked. "Yes, but source them locally if possible. I want everything about this event to celebrate the Low Country." The sound of small feet running down the hallway announced Aurelius's approach before he burst through the door, his dark curls slightly damp from afternoon rain and his brown eyes bright with excitement. At 3 years old, he moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had never doubted he was loved completely. "Mama, Jude's here," he announced, throwing himself into her arms with childhood's abandon. "He brought new books!" Behind him, Jude appeared in the doorway, shaking rain from his dark coat and carrying a leather satchel that undoubtedly contained the latest additions to Aurelius's impressive library. Over the past months, he had made it his mission to ensure the boy had access to stories that would feed his obviously sharp mind. What had started as thoughtful gifts had evolved into something deeper. Jude remembered which stories were Aurelius's favorites, which characters sparked his imagination, which questions the boy asked that revealed his curious nature. He brought books about dragons and knights, about children who looked like Aurelius, about families that were built from love rather than just biology. "Working late again?" Jude asked, his green eyes taking in the scattered papers and the coffee cup that had grown cold hours ago. "The Whitmore Gala is in 3 weeks, Delaney explained, accepting his kiss on her cheek, a gesture that still sent warmth through her entire body. "If this succeeds, it could transform the business completely. And if it doesn't, then I'll have learned an expensive lesson about overextending myself." Aurelius had already climbed into Jude's lap and was examining the new books with a scholar's serious attention. "Dragons," he announced, pointing to a cover illustration. "Yes, dragons," Jude confirmed. "But these are the kind of dragons who learn to use their power to help others instead of frightening people." Delaney watched them together, marveling at how naturally Jude had slipped into a paternal role. He never overstepped boundaries, never tried to replace Daniel in Aurelius's life, but simply filled empty spaces with patience and love until the boy began calling him Daddy Jude without anyone suggesting it. She had been so afraid of letting another man into their lives, terrified that Aurelius would be hurt if things didn't work out. But watching them read together, seeing how Jude listened to her son's chatter with genuine interest, how he remembered every detail about Aurelius's likes and dislikes, she realized that some fears were worth conquering. "I need to tell you something," Jude said suddenly, his voice carrying unusual tension that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. "What is it?" "There's been a development with Willis Enterprises." He shifted Aurelius to his other knee, his expression growing serious in a way that made the room feel colder. "Daniel's been borrowing against future earnings to cover current debts. If those projections don't materialize, the company goes under," Delaney finished, her voice flat with the weight of understanding. "Completely. And all the shares, yours, mine, Daniel's, become worthless paper." The words hit her like ice water thrown in her face. Everything she had planned for Aurelius's future suddenly felt precarious, built on sand instead of bedrock. The college fund she had been building in her mind, the security she had thought was guaranteed, the foundation for her son's independence, all of it could disappear. "How long do we have?" 6 months? Possibly less. Aurelius looked up at the adults, sensing tension in their voices with the intuitive radar that children possessed. His little face scrunched with concern, and he reached up to pat Jude's cheek in the comforting gesture he had perfected. "Don't worry, Daddy Jude," he said solemnly, his small voice carrying the absolute faith of someone who had never encountered a problem his family couldn't solve. "Mama fixes everything." The simple faith in his voice brought tears to Delaney's eyes. This child believed in her completely, trusted that she could solve any problem, overcome any obstacle. The weight of that trust was both terrifying and inspiring, a responsibility that felt heavier than any business decision she had ever made. "What are our options?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the panic clawing at her chest. "We could sell our shares to Daniel for whatever we can get," cut our losses before they become total losses. Or we could buy more shares at the reduced price and try to turn the company around ourselves. With what money? Delaney laughed, but there was no humor in it, only the bitter recognition of how quickly circumstances could change. I've invested everything in this expansion. I don't have liquid capital for a corporate takeover. I do. The quiet words hung in the air between them like a bridge over dangerous waters. Delaney stared at Jude, seeing something in his green eyes that made her stomach clench with a mixture of gratitude and terror. How much are we talking about? Everything, he said simply, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was offering. My entire liquid net worth, every asset I can leverage. It would be the biggest financial gamble of my life. Why would you even consider that? The question came out more desperate than she intended. Jude, if this fails, you lose everything. Your security, your future, your children's inheritance. I don't have children, he interrupted gently, but I love yours as if he were my own. The admission hung between them, heavy with implications that neither of them had been brave enough to voice until now. Jude was quiet for a long moment, his attention apparently focused on helping Aurelius turn the pages of his new book. But when he looked up, his eyes held a depth of emotion that took her breath away. Because I believe in you, he said quietly. Because I've watched you build something extraordinary from nothing, and I know you could do the same with Willis Enterprises. Because Aurelius deserves to inherit something meaningful, not just money. And because I love you, he said simply, the words falling into the space between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would change everything. Both of you. And when you love someone, you invest in their dreams, even when it's terrifying. The words she had been afraid to hear, afraid to hope for, hung in the air like a promise finally spoken. Aurelius clapped his hands with delight, as if he understood that something wonderful had just happened. Jude, Delaney whispered, feeling tears prick her eyes, as emotions she had kept carefully contained for months finally broke free. You don't have to say anything, he said quickly, misreading her expression. I know this is complicated. I know you're still healing from what Daniel did. I just needed you to know where I stand, what this means to me. That's not, she began, but was interrupted by the sharp ring of her phone cutting through the moment like a blade. Isadora Chen's number appeared on the screen, and Delaney answered immediately, her lawyer's timing as impeccable as it was unwelcome. We have an emergency, the lawyer said without preamble, her voice carrying the kind of urgency that made Delaney's blood run cold. Daniel just defaulted on a major loan. The bank is calling in the debt immediately, and he doesn't have liquid assets to cover it. What does that mean for our shares? If Willis Enterprises files for bankruptcy, we lose everything. But there's a small window, maybe 48 hours, where we could acquire the company's assets before the bank does. How much would that cost? More than you have, but potentially less than what the company could be worth if it's properly managed. After she hung up, Delaney sat in the gathering darkness of her office, holding her son, while the man she was falling in love with waited for her to make a decision that would affect all their futures. Outside, Charleston settled into evening, the city lights beginning to twinkle like stars fallen to earth. The magnitude of the choice before her felt overwhelming. Accept Jude's offer and risk destroying the man she was learning to love, refuse it, and watch her son's inheritance disappear into Daniel's failures. If we do this, she said slowly, testing each word before speaking it, and it fails, you lose everything. If we don't do it, Aurelius loses his inheritance anyway. And if it succeeds, then your son becomes one of the most powerful young men in Charleston, and you become the woman who brought down the man who tried to destroy her. Aurelius had fallen asleep in Jude's arms, his small body completely relaxed, in the trust that he was safe and loved. The sight of them together, this gentle man and her precious son, filled Delaney with a certainty she hadn't felt since before the cathedral. "Do it," she said quietly, the words carrying the weight of absolute decision. "Are you sure?" "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm sure about us. I'm sure about what we could build together." Jude's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face with relief and joy. "Together." "I love you too," she said, the words coming easier than she had expected, as if they had been waiting years to be spoken. "And I'm tired of letting fear make my decisions." As if summoned by the sound of his mother's confession, Aurelius stirred awake and looked around the darkened office with sleepy confusion. "Time to go home?" he asked, his voice thick with drowsiness. "Yes, little emperor," Delaney replied, gathering him into her arms where he belonged. "Time to go home." But as they left the office and stepped into the rainy Charleston night, Delaney understood that home wasn't a place anymore. It was the feeling of being loved completely, trusted absolutely, and supported unconditionally. The war with Daniel was entering its final phase, but for the first time, Delaney felt like she was fighting for something greater than revenge. She was fighting for love, for family, for the future she was finally brave enough to claim. Chapter 7. The Reckoning Rises. 3.5 years after cathedral bells had rung for a wedding that never was, Delaney Cox Glover stood in the executive boardroom of Willis Enterprises, her wedding ring catching morning light as she prepared to deliver the decisive blow to the man who had once destroyed her world with his betrayal. The corporate takeover had been swift and surgical. Within 48 hours of Daniel's default, Jude had leveraged every asset he owned to acquire Willis Enterprises' debt from the bank, effectively making them new owners of a company worth $200 million on paper, though its actual value remained questionable. "The quarterly reports," Isadora Chen announced, spreading documents across the polished conference table. As their corporate attorney, she had orchestrated the legal mechanics of the acquisition with the precision of a chess master. Willis Enterprises is hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate, but the underlying assets remain solid. Delaney studied the financial statements, her business acumen sharpened by 3.5 years of building her own empire from nothing. At 30, she had evolved into a formidable force, beautiful, intelligent, and possessed of the kind of quiet power that made boardrooms fall silent when she spoke. "What about the commercial real estate division?" she asked. "Undervalued and mismanaged," Jude replied from across the table. At 33, marriage and fatherhood had added depth to his natural authority. He wore success easily, like perfectly tailored clothing. With proper management, it could be worth 60% more than current market value. The sound of small feet running down the hallway announced Aurelius's approach before he burst through the boardroom doors, his brown eyes bright with excitement and his dark curls bouncing with each step. At 3.5 years old, he moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had been raised to believe that boardrooms and business meetings were as natural as playgrounds. "Mama, Daddy," he announced, climbing into the chair between them with practiced ease. "Miss Margaret said I could visit since it's my company too." 40% your company," Delaney corrected gently, smoothing his hair. "You're the largest individual shareholder, which means you have a responsibility to the people who work here." Aurelius nodded solemnly, though his attention was quickly captured by the impressive view from the 42nd floor windows. Charleston spread below them like a map of possibilities, the harbor sparkling in the distance. "Mr. Willis is here," Margaret announced from the doorway, her voice carefully neutral. As Daniel's former assistant, she had witnessed the company's decline firsthand and seemed quietly pleased by the change in management. Daniel Willis entered the boardroom like a man walking to his execution, his once perfect confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of someone who had lost everything. At 36, he looked older, his sandy hair thinning and his expensive suit unable to disguise the weight he had lost from stress. Behind him, Serafina Vale tottered on stiletto heels, her emerald dress a poor attempt to maintain the luxury she had grown accustomed to. 3.5 years of marriage to a failing businessman had hardened her beauty into something brittle and desperate. "Delaney," Daniel said, his voice hoarse, "I need to speak with you." "You can speak with Mrs. Cox, Glover," Isadora corrected sharply, "and anything you have to say can be said in front of our legal counsel." Daniel's eyes moved to Jude, then to Aurelius, who was now spinning slowly in his chair with the serious concentration of a child conducting important experiments in physics. "You have to understand," Daniel began, his voice cracking slightly. "I never meant for things to go this far. The company was my father's legacy, my grandfather's dream. And now it's my son's inheritance," Delaney replied calmly. "The son you denied, the child you refused to acknowledge." "I was wrong," Daniel said, the words rushing out. "I know I was wrong, but please, there has to be some way we can work this out, some compromise." Aurelius stopped spinning and fixed his gaze on the man who had contributed half his DNA, but none of his upbringing. The child's stare was intense and unsettling, as if he could see through Daniel's desperate facade to the weakness beneath. "Who is that man, Mama?" Aurelius asked, his voice carrying the innocent directness of childhood. "That's Mr. Willis," Delaney replied carefully. "He used to own this company." "Why doesn't he own it anymore?" "Because he made choices that had consequences." Aurelius nodded, as if this explanation made perfect sense, then returned his attention to the view outside the windows. To him, Daniel Willis was just another stranger with no claim on his attention or affection. "The truth is," Isadora said, opening another folder, "Willis Enterprises owes creditors over $40 million. The previous management's attempts to service that debt through asset liquidation have only made the situation worse." "But the company could be profitable again," Daniel insisted. "Give me 6 months, a year, and I can turn it around." "With what capital?" Jude asked quietly. "You've mortgaged every asset, borrowed against future earnings, and alienated most of your major clients." "I need time," Daniel pleaded. "This company is all I have left." "No," Serafina interjected sharply, her green eyes flashing with the desperation of someone watching her meal ticket disappear. "What you need is to fight this. They can't just steal what's rightfully yours." "Actually, they can," Isadora said with professional satisfaction. "And they did. Completely legally, using standard corporate acquisition procedures." Aurelius looked up from his chair-spinning experiment, his attention caught by Serafina's shrill voice. His brown eyes studied her with the same intense focus he had given Daniel, but his small face scrunched with obvious dislike. "That lady sounds mean," he announced with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Aurelius?" Delaney chided gently, though she couldn't entirely suppress her smile. "But she does sound mean, Mama. I can tell." Serafina's face flushed red, her carefully maintained composure cracking. "How dare you let that child—" "That child," Jude interrupted, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, "is the rightful owner of this company. Show some respect." "Respect?" Serafina's voice rose to near hysteria. "For the illegitimate spawn of a scheming—" She never finished the sentence. Delaney rose from her chair with the fluid grace of a predator, her brown eyes blazing with protective fury. "Get out," she said quietly, but her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Both of you, now." "Delaney, please," Daniel began, but she cut him off with a gesture. "You had your chance to be a father. You chose another woman over your son. You humiliated me publicly and tried to deny his very existence." Her voice grew stronger with each word. And now you want mercy? He's my son too, Daniel said desperately. Aurelius looked up at the mention of parentage, his young face confused. Daddy? He asked, turning to Jude with complete trust. Yes, buddy, Jude replied gently. Is that man my daddy too? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Jude looked at Delaney, silently asking permission to handle this delicate moment. That man helped create you, Jude said carefully, but he's never been your daddy. Being a daddy isn't about biology, it's about love and teaching and being there when you need someone. Aurelius considered this explanation with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence. So you're my real daddy, if you want me to be. I do, Aurelius said simply, then returned to his chair spinning as if the matter was settled beyond question. Daniel's face crumpled at his son's casual dismissal. Whatever fantasy he had harbored about reclaiming his paternal role died in that moment, killed by a 3-year-old's honest assessment of love versus genetics. Please, he whispered, but the fight had gone out of him. Security will escort you out, Delaney said, pressing the intercom button. Don't come back. As Daniel and Serafina were led away, their voices echoing angrily down the hallway, Aurelius continued his experiments in centrifugal force, oblivious to the drama he had just helped resolve. That was beautifully handled, Isadora observed, gathering her papers. It was necessary, Delaney replied, settling back into her chair. He needed to understand that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Outside the windows, Charleston glittered in afternoon sun, and Willis Enterprises, now effectively the Cox-Glover empire, hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-managed machine. The war was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted decisively. Aurelius spun one more time, then climbed into his mother's lap, his small arms wrapping around her neck. Are we the bosses now, Mama? Yes, little Emperor, we're the bosses now. And for the first time since the cathedral, Delaney felt like justice was finally within reach. Chapter 8. The Hunter Becomes Hunted. 8 months after the corporate takeover that had shifted Charleston's business landscape, Delaney Cox-Glover stood in her corner office, watching the harbor fade into twilight while orchestrating the final moves in a chess game that had been 4 years in the making. The transformation of Willis Enterprises had been nothing short of miraculous. Under Jude's strategic vision and Delaney's operational excellence, the company had not only stabilized but begun to thrive. The commercial real estate division was generating 40% more revenue than under Daniel's mismanagement, and 4 major construction projects had brought the company back from bankruptcy's brink. The Patterson account just signed for the waterfront development, Ophelia announced, entering with evening reports. That's another $20 million in contracted revenue. Excellent, Delaney replied, though her attention was focused on financial documents spread across her desk. What about the Henderson property? They're requesting a meeting. Apparently, they've reconsidered your offer. 8 months ago, the Henderson family would never have taken a meeting with a young black woman, regardless of her business acumen. Now, as controlling shareholder of one of Charleston's largest companies, Delaney found that old prejudices crumbled quickly in the face of economic power. The elevator chimed, and Jude appeared in the doorway, loosening his tie after a long day of board meetings and strategic planning. At 33, success suited him naturally. He carried authority effortlessly, but always with the gentle strength that had first attracted her. How was the bank meeting? Delaney asked, accepting his kiss and marveling at how natural this domestic intimacy had become. Better than expected. They're willing to extend our credit line for the downtown expansion. Jude settled into the chair across from her desk, his green eyes serious. But there's something else we need to discuss. Daniel. Over the past 8 months, Daniel Willis had become a broken man. The loss of his company, his home, and his social standing had reduced him to a shadow of his former arrogant self. He had taken a job selling insurance for a firm in North Charleston, driving a 12-year-old sedan and living in a studio apartment that cost less than he used to spend on wine monthly. But broken men, Delaney had learned, were often the most dangerous. Desperation could drive people to extremes that rational thought would never allow. "What's he done now?" Delaney asked, though part of her already suspected. "He's been calling our major clients, trying to convince them that the company is unstable under new management, spreading rumors about impending layoffs and financial irregularities." "Any success?" "Not yet, but he's persistent, and eventually someone might listen." Jude's expression darkened with concern. "There's more. He's been asking questions about our upcoming projects, trying to gather inside information." "Corporate espionage?" "The beginning of it, yes." The sound of small feet running down the hallway announced Aurelius's approach. At 4 years old, he had grown tall for his age, with his mother's graceful movements and an intelligence that sometimes startled adults with its clarity. "Mama! Daddy!" he called out, bursting into the office with his usual enthusiasm. "Miss Margaret taught me how to use the copy machine." "Did she now?" Delaney replied, lifting him into her lap. "And what were you copying?" "My drawings of dragons," Aurelius said seriously, "for all the offices, so everyone can have dragons to protect them." The innocence of his gesture, wanting to share his artwork to make others happy, filled Delaney with the familiar fierce protectiveness that had driven every decision since his birth. "That's very thoughtful, little Emperor," Jude said, ruffling the boy's dark curls. "Dragons are excellent protection." "Especially smart dragons," Aurelius agreed. "The smart ones always win." From the mouths of children, Delaney thought, remembering her grandmother's words about young ones seeing truth more clearly than adults. Smart dragons, strategic thinking, using intelligence as a weapon. "Jude," she said suddenly, an idea forming with crystalline clarity. "What if we let Daniel succeed?" "What do you mean?" "What if we let him undermine our company? What if we help him do it?" Jude stared at her, as if she had suggested setting fire to the building. "Delaney, we've spent months rebuilding." "Hear me out," she interrupted, her mind racing through possibilities with the strategic thinking that had made her successful in both business and warfare. "Daniel's desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. What if we gave him an opportunity to make a very big mistake?" "Such as?" Delaney was quiet for a moment, her mind working through the psychology of her enemy. Daniel's greatest weakness had always been his arrogance, his assumption that he was smarter than everyone around him. Even now, reduced to selling insurance, he probably believed he could outsmart them. What if we leaked information suggesting that Willis Enterprises is considering a major acquisition? Something that would require significant capital investment, but offer enormous returns. False information, misleading information, technically accurate but deliberately incomplete. Delaney's voice grew stronger as the plan took shape. "We create documentation for a fictional project, complete with financial projections and partnership agreements." Jude's green eyes began to gleam with understanding. If Daniel thought he could regain his company by sabotaging a major deal, he'd do whatever it took to interfere, and in the process, he'd commit corporate espionage, breach of fiduciary duty, and probably a dozen other crimes that would land him in federal prison. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. They would use Daniel's own desperation and arrogance against him, creating an irresistible trap baited with the one thing he wanted most, the chance to destroy them. Aurelius looked back and forth between his parents, following the conversation with the intensity of someone who understood that important things were being discussed, even if the details were beyond his comprehension. "Is Mr. Daniel the bad man?" he asked with startling directness. "Why do you ask that, sweetheart?" "Because whenever you talk about him, you get the same look Grandma Magnolia gets when she talks about people who hurt her family." The observation was so accurate and delivered with such innocent clarity that both adults fell silent. This child, Daniel's biological son, had absorbed family history through overheard conversations and adult emotions, creating his own understanding of the man who had contributed to his existence, but nothing to his life. "Yes," Delaney said finally, deciding that honesty was better than evasion. "Mr. Daniel hurt our family very badly." "Then we should stop him," Aurelius said with the simple logic of childhood. "That's what heroes do." "And how do heroes stop bad people?" Jude asked gently. "They're smarter than them," Aurelius replied immediately, "and they protect the people they love." The wisdom in his words hit Delaney like revelation. For 4 years, she had been motivated by anger, hurt, and desire for revenge. But her son's perspective shifted everything into focus. This wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about protection. "You're right, little emperor," she said, holding him close. "It's time to protect our family." That evening, after Aurelius had been picked up by his beloved grandmother Magnolia for their weekly sleepover, Delaney and Jude worked late into the night, crafting a plan that would give Daniel Willis exactly what he thought he wanted: the opportunity to destroy them, while ensuring that he would destroy himself in the process. The details required careful orchestration. They would need to create believable documentation, establish fake communication channels, and plant information where Daniel would be certain to find it. Every detail had to be perfect. Every piece of evidence had to withstand scrutiny up to the point where Daniel committed himself to illegal action. "The Riverfront Renaissance Project," Jude said, pointing to the fabricated documents they had created. 300 million in development funding, partnership with 4 major corporations, and the potential to transform downtown Charleston completely. "And completely fictional," Delaney added with satisfaction, "but believable enough that Daniel will think he's found our weakness." They had crafted the perfect bait, a project so large and lucrative that Daniel would be unable to resist trying to sabotage it. The partnerships were with real companies, but the agreements were fabricated. The financial projections were based on actual market data, but the timeline was impossible. To an outside observer doing casual research, it would appear legitimate. To someone with inside knowledge, willing to make illegal contact with the supposed partners, the fiction would become apparent, but only after they had incriminated themselves. "He'll try to contact our supposed partners, convince them that Willis Enterprises is financially unstable and unreliable. And when they report his interference to us, we'll have grounds for restraining orders, corporate espionage charges, and possibly criminal prosecution. The beauty of it," Delaney continued, "is that he'll think he's being clever. He'll believe he's found the perfect way to bring us down." "It's brilliant," Jude admitted. "But are you sure you want to go this far?" Delaney thought about her son's words, about the importance of protecting the people you love. She thought about the 4 years of Daniel's attempts to undermine everything they had built, his refusal to acknowledge his son, his public humiliation of her at what should have been the happiest moment of her life. "Daniel Willis chose to make war on my family," she said, her voice carrying the steel that had been forged in the fires of his betrayal. "He humiliated me publicly, denied his son, and has spent the last year trying to destroy everything we've built. I'm not interested in mercy anymore." "What about Aurelius?" "Someday he'll ask about his biological father. And I'll tell him the truth, that his biological father was a weak man who chose pride over love, cruelty over kindness, and revenge over redemption." Delaney's brown eyes blazed with determination. "And that his real father was the man who chose us, who fought for us, who loved us enough to risk everything." As they finalized their plan, Charleston slept peacefully outside their windows, unaware that in a corner office overlooking the harbor, justice was finally being served with the precision of a master chef and the patience of someone who understood that the best revenge was served at exactly the right temperature. The trap was set with mathematical precision. Daniel Willis, in his desperation to reclaim what he had lost, would walk straight into it. And this time, when he fell, there would be no one left to catch him. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and Daniel Willis was walking straight into a trap of his own making. Chapter 9. The Noose Tightens. 7 months later, on a crisp October morning that promised autumn's renewal, Delaney Cox Glover stood in the federal courthouse watching Daniel Willis being led away in handcuffs, the sound of metal against metal echoing through marble hallways like the closing of a book she had been writing for 4.5 years. The corporate espionage charges had stuck exactly as planned. Daniel's desperate attempts to sabotage the fictional Riverfront Renaissance project had led him to break federal laws regarding corporate communications, breach of fiduciary duty, and attempted fraud. His calls to Willis Enterprises' supposed partners had been recorded, his emails preserved, and his increasingly frantic attempts to destroy their business had provided prosecutors with enough evidence to ensure a 3 to 5 year federal prison sentence. "Justice served," Isadora Chen murmured, closing her briefcase with the satisfaction of an attorney who had just won the case of her career. But as Delaney watched the man who had once promised her forever disappear through courthouse doors, she felt no triumph, only the hollow satisfaction of a war finally ended and the exhaustion that comes from carrying anger too long. Mrs. Cox Glover, a young reporter approached hesitantly, her recorder already running. "Would you care to comment on today's verdict?" "No comment," Delaney replied, her voice carrying the authority that had become second nature. This was a matter of justice, not revenge. The distinction mattered to her, even if it seemed subtle to outside observers. Revenge was personal and petty. Justice was righteous and necessary. Outside the courthouse, Charleston basked in early autumn sunshine, the city beautiful and eternal as it had been for centuries. Jude waited by their car, holding Aurelius, who was now 4.5 years old and possessed of his mother's sharp intelligence combined with his stepfather's gentle strength. "Is the bad man gone now, Mama?" Aurelius asked as they drove home. "Yes, sweetheart, he's gone." "Good," the boy said with the finality of someone passing judgment. "Now we can just be happy." The simplicity of his observation struck Delaney with unexpected force. For 4.5 years her life had been defined by the aftermath of Daniel's betrayal. Every decision, every goal, every moment of satisfaction had been colored by the desire to prove him wrong, to make him pay, to show the world that she was stronger than his cruelty. But now, with justice finally served, she found herself wondering who she was when she wasn't fighting a war. "Mama," Aurelius's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Are you sad?" "No, baby, I'm just thinking." "About what?" "About what comes next." That evening, after Aurelius had been tucked into bed with his usual collection of books and toy dragons, Delaney and Jude sat on the veranda of their new home, a beautifully restored antebellum mansion in the historic district that had once seemed as impossible as happiness itself. "No celebration dinner?" Jude asked, settling beside her on the porch swing that had become their favorite place for evening conversations. "I don't feel like celebrating," Delaney admitted. "I thought I would, but instead I just feel empty." "You've been fighting this battle for 4.5 years. It's natural to feel disoriented when it's finally over." "Is it over, though?" "Daniel will get out of prison eventually. He'll still be Aurelius's biological father. That connection will always exist." Jude was quiet for a moment, his green eyes studying the garden where Aurelius played each morning, chasing butterflies and collecting interesting stones. "Biology doesn't make a father, Delaney. You know that better than anyone." "Do I?" The question came out more vulnerable than she had intended. "Sometimes I wonder if I've been so focused on punishing Daniel that I've forgotten how to simply live." "What do you mean?" I mean that for 4.5 years, every decision has been strategic. Every choice has been calculated to build power, accumulate resources, position ourselves for the next battle. She turned to face him fully. When was the last time we did something just because it made us happy? Jude's smile was gentle. This morning, when we read Aurelius 4 extra stories because he asked nicely. Yesterday, when you spent an hour teaching him to braid friendship bracelets instead of reviewing contracts. Last week, when we danced in the kitchen while dinner burned because our favorite song came on the radio. Those were small moments. Small moments are what life is made of, Delaney. The big battles, the grand gestures, the public victories, those are just stage dressing. Real life happens in the quiet spaces between. As if summoned by their conversation, Aurelius appeared in the doorway, his dark hair tousled from sleep, and his brown eyes bright with the kind of important announcement that couldn't wait until morning. I had a dream, he announced, climbing onto the swing between them. What kind of dream, little emperor? Delaney asked, pulling him close. I dreamed that we were all dragons, flying over Charleston. And we weren't fighting anybody. We were just flying because it felt good. The image was so perfect, so pure in its simple joy, that Delaney felt tears prick her eyes. Her 4-year-old son had articulated something she couldn't, the possibility of power without conflict, strength without anger, family without fear. That sounds like a beautiful dream, Jude said, ruffling the boy's hair. It wasn't a dream, Aurelius corrected seriously. It was a plan. Later that night, after Aurelius had been convinced to return to bed with promises of dragon stories tomorrow, Delaney stood in her home office looking at the wall where she had hung Willis Enterprises' quarterly reports. The company was thriving under their management, employing over 400 people and contributing millions to Charleston's economy. But for the first time in years, the numbers felt like just numbers, important, but not the measure of her worth or happiness. The foundation, she said suddenly. What foundation? Jude asked from the doorway. The one we're going to start, for literacy programs, scholarship funds, mentorship for young entrepreneurs. The ideas came rapidly, as if they had been waiting years to be released. We'll use the profits from Willis Enterprises to fund opportunities for kids who look like Aurelius, who come from families like mine. That's a beautiful idea. It's more than beautiful. It's necessary. Delaney turned from the wall of reports, her brown eyes blazing with new purpose. Daniel Willis thought he could destroy me by taking away my fairy tale ending, but what he actually did was teach me that I didn't need a prince to rescue me. I needed to become the queen who rescues others. Jude's smile was radiant with pride and love. Queen Delaney, I like the sound of that. With King Jude and Prince Aurelius, she replied, moving into his arms, building a kingdom based on love instead of revenge. As they held each other in the quiet of their home, Charleston settled into sleep around them. Somewhere across the city, Daniel Willis was beginning his first night in federal prison, finally facing the consequences of his choices. But here, in this house, filled with love and possibility, the future stretched ahead like an open book waiting to be written, not in anger or revenge, but in hope, joy, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest victory is learning when to stop fighting and start living. The war was over. Life could finally begin. Chapter 10. Justice and Love. Triumphant. 5 years after cathedral bells had rung for a wedding that never was, Delaney Cox Glover stood in sunlit garden of her grandmother's house, watching her 6-year-old son chase butterflies, while Charleston awakened to a morning that would bring final closure to the longest chapter of her life. The call had come at dawn. Daniel Willis had been released from federal prison after serving 3 years for corporate espionage. His early release for good behavior meant he was now free to attempt some sort of reconciliation or revenge, though Delaney suspected he had neither the resources nor the energy for either. "Mama, look," Aurelius called out, cupping his hands around something precious. I caught a butterfly, but I'm going to let it go because Daddy says beautiful things should be free. Very wise, little Emperor, Delaney replied, marveling at how her son had grown into someone who understood both power and kindness. At 6, he was tall for his age, with an intelligence that manifested in thoughtful questions and careful observations about the world around him. The butterfly lifted from his palms in a flutter of orange and black wings, dancing through morning air as if celebrating its freedom. Aurelius watched it go with satisfaction, already turning his attention to the next wonder that caught his eye. Mrs. Coxglover? Margaret appeared at the garden gate, her voice carrying the careful neutrality she used for difficult announcements. Mr. Willis is here to see you. Delaney felt her spine straighten with the automatic response of someone who had spent years preparing for battle. But as she looked at her son, happily examining a caterpillar he had discovered on a gardenia bush, she realized that the anger she had carried for so long had simply evaporated. "Send him back," she said quietly. Daniel Willis appeared moments later, and Delaney was shocked by the transformation 3 years had wrought. The arrogant businessman who had humiliated her at the altar was gone, replaced by a man who looked far older than his 39 years. His sandy hair had gone grey at the temples, his expensive suits had been replaced by cheap clothing, and his blue eyes held the hollow look of someone who had lost everything and found no redemption in the losing. "Delaney," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "thank you for seeing me." "Daniel." She kept her voice neutral, protective instincts on high alert despite his obvious defeat. Aurelius looked up from his caterpillar investigation, his brown eyes studying the stranger with the careful attention he gave to anything new in his environment. There was no recognition in his gaze. Why would there be? This man was a stranger who happened to share his DNA. "Is this him?" Daniel whispered, and Delaney could hear the wonder mixed with regret in his voice. "This is my son Aurelius," she replied firmly. "Say hello, sweetheart." "Hello," Aurelius said politely, then immediately returned his attention to the caterpillar. "Mama, do you think this one will turn into a butterfly too?" "I think it might, if we give it time and the right environment to grow." Daniel's face crumpled at the casual dismissal, but he seemed to understand that he had forfeited any claim to his son's attention through 6 years of absence. "He's beautiful," Daniel said. "He looks like you." "He is beautiful," Delaney agreed, "and he's kind, intelligent, loved, and surrounded by people who would do anything to protect him." The implicit warning was clear, and Daniel nodded his understanding. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," he said quickly. "I came to apologize, and to tell you that I won't contest the adoption, Jude Glover's petition to legally adopt Aurelius. My lawyer told me about it before I was released." Daniel's voice grew quieter. "I won't fight it. I'll sign whatever papers are necessary." The news hit Delaney like sunshine after storm clouds. Jude had been quietly working to legally formalize what had been true in their hearts for years. Soon, Aurelius would officially have the father he deserved, and Daniel's biological connection would be legally severed. "Why?" she asked. "Because I don't deserve to be his father," Daniel replied simply. "Because I threw away the most precious gifts life ever offered me, your love and his existence, because the man raising him is a better father than I ever could have been." Aurelius had abandoned his caterpillar hunt and was now building a tower out of fallen magnolia leaves, his concentration absolute as he balanced each piece with careful precision. "I also came to tell you about Serafina," Daniel continued. "What about her? She left me 8 months into my sentence, took what little money I had left and moved to Monaco with a banker she'd been seeing behind my back." Daniel's laugh was bitter. Turns out she was exactly what you thought she was, someone who only cared about wealth and status. "I'm sorry," Delaney said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. "Don't be. It was justice. I destroyed a good woman's trust to chase after someone who never loved me at all." Daniel's eyes moved to Aurelius, who was now explaining to his leaf tower why it needed to be exactly 7 stories tall. "I lost everything that mattered for something that was worthless. And now? Now I work for a construction company in North Charleston. I live in a 1-bedroom apartment and drive a 20-year-old truck. I have no money, no prospects, and no one who cares whether I live or die." Daniel's voice held no self-pity, just the flat acknowledgement of consequences. "But for the first time in 6 years, I'm not angry at anyone but myself." The sound of car doors slamming announced new arrivals, and Delaney looked up to see Jude emerging from their sedan, followed by Magnolia, who moved with the careful dignity of her 85 years, but with the bright eyes of someone still fully engaged with life. "Daddy!" Aurelius shouted, abandoning his leaf tower to run into Jude's arms. The boy's joy was absolute, unquestioned, complete. Jude lifted him easily, his green eyes taking in the scene with quick assessment before settling on Delaney's face. "Everything all right?" "Everything's perfect," she replied, and realized it was true. Magnolia approached Daniel with the measured steps of someone who had lived long enough to see patterns repeat themselves across generations. "Mr. Willis," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years and wisdom. "Mrs. James," he replied respectfully. "You look well. I am well. More importantly, my family is well." She studied his face with the sharp eyes of someone who could see through pretense to truth. "You look like a man who's learned some hard lessons." "Yes, ma'am. Too late, but yes." "It's never too late to choose better," Magnolia said gently. "The question is whether you have the strength to keep choosing better, even when no one's watching." Aurelius had convinced Jude to examine his caterpillar discovery, and the two of them were now crouched by the gardenia bush, engaged in serious conversation about metamorphosis and the patience required for transformation. "That's my real father," Aurelius announced proudly, pointing at Jude. "He teaches me things and reads me stories and helps Mama when she's tired." Daniel watched them together, this man who had chosen to love another man's child and the boy who had never questioned that love, and something in his expression shifted from regret to acceptance. "He's lucky to have such a good father," Daniel said quietly. "We're all lucky," Aurelius replied, with the simple confidence of a child who had never doubted he was loved. "Daddy says love makes families, not blood." "Your daddy is very wise." "I know," Aurelius said matter-of-factly, then bounded over to show his great-grandmother the caterpillar that might become a butterfly. In the comfortable chaos of family gathering, Daniel seemed to shrink, becoming less present until he was almost invisible among people who loved each other deeply. "I should go," he said quietly. "Daniel," Delaney called as he turned toward the gate. When he looked back, she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there 6 years ago, genuine remorse and the beginning of wisdom. "I hope you find peace." "I hope so too," he replied. "And Delaney?" "Thank you." "For what?" "For raising him to be kind, for not poisoning him against me, even though you had every right to." Daniel's voice grew thick with emotion. "For being a better person than I ever was." After he left, the garden settled back into its natural rhythm. Magnolia settled into her favorite chair to watch Aurelius hunt for more caterpillars, while Jude joined Delaney by the magnolia tree where her great-grandmother had been married 90 years earlier. "How do you feel?" he asked, taking her hand in his. "Free," Delaney said simply. "For the first time in 6 years, completely free." "The adoption papers should be finalized next week," Jude said quietly. "Aurelius James Cox Glover. It has a perfect ring to it." He's been yours since the day he was born, Delaney replied. This just makes it official. Aurelius appeared at their side, his small hand slipping into his mother's with the easy affection of a child who had never questioned his place in the world. Mama, when the caterpillar becomes a butterfly, will it remember being a caterpillar? I don't know, sweetheart. Why do you ask? Because if it remembers, it might be sad about not being what it used to be. But if it doesn't remember, it can just be happy about being something beautiful. The wisdom in his words struck both adults silent. From the mouths of children came the truth that had taken Delaney 6 years to understand. That transformation required letting go of what you were to become, what you were meant to be. I think, Jude said carefully, that maybe the butterfly remembers enough to be grateful for the journey, but not so much that it can't enjoy flying. That's a good answer, Daddy, Aurelius said with approval, then ran off to help his great-grandmother identify the birds visiting her bird feeder. As the morning sun climbed higher over Charleston, Delaney stood in the garden where 4 generations of her family had found love, lost love, and learned to love again. The cathedral bells rang in the distance, not for weddings or funerals, but simply marking time, the passage of hours in a life finally lived without fear. Ready to go home? Jude asked. We are home, Delaney replied, looking around the garden where her son played in perfect security, where her grandmother dispensed wisdom and love in equal measure, where the man who had chosen them stood ready to build whatever future they could dream. The war was over. Justice had been served. Love had triumphed not through grand gestures or dramatic victories, but through the patient accumulation of days filled with kindness, laughter, and the quiet certainty that some bonds, the ones forged in choice rather than chance, were strong enough to last forever. 6 years after cathedral bells had rung for a wedding that never was, Delaney Cox Glover had finally found her happily ever after, and it was more beautiful than any fairy tale she had ever imagined. As they gathered their things to leave, Aurelius ran back to them one more time, his face bright with excitement. Mama, Daddy, guess what? What, little emperor? They asked in unison. The caterpillar is already starting to build its chrysalis. Miss Magnolia says in 2 weeks we'll have a brand new butterfly. He took both their hands and skipped between them toward the car, chattering excitedly about transformation and new beginnings, completely unaware that he had just provided the perfect metaphor for their family's own beautiful metamorphosis. Behind them, Charleston glittered in the morning sun, eternal and graceful as it had been for centuries. And somewhere across town, Daniel Willis was beginning a new chapter of his life, one written in humility rather than pride, acceptance rather than entitlement. But their story was no longer connected to his. Their story was about love, family, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest victory is not in defeating your enemies, but in building something so beautiful that their defeat becomes irrelevant. They drove home through Charleston's historic streets, past the cathedral where it all began, past the offices where empires were built, past the gardens where love bloomed, toward a future written in hope rather than revenge, in joy rather than anger, in the simple, profound understanding that love, real love, always wins in the end.